And suddenly, above the front line, something appears that breaks every rule. There's no propeller. It makes no familiar sound. It simply slips past you at a speed that makes your Mustang, the pride of American aviation, seem as if it's standing still. This wasn't just a new airplane. It was a fracture in reality. The Messerschmitt Me262, Schwalbe, the Swallow. In history books, the Me262 often appears as a wonder weapon that arrived a few months too late. We hear the narrative of brilliant technology suppressed by the mistakes of Adolf Hitler. But that's only a convenient simplification. When we look closer, we see something far more unsettling. We see a machine that even the Luftwaffe feared. And not because it was bad, because it was too modern for a world that was already falling apart. This is where the problem with the Swallow's legend begins. We think of it as a triumph of engineering, but for people who had to maintain it, fuel it, and fly it, the Me262 was a nightmare hidden beneath smooth metal skin. It was an aircraft that required the precision of a watchmaker at a time when Germany no longer even had time to sleep. People often say the Me262 could have won the war in the skies over Germany if only it had been allowed to be a fighter from the very beginning. You know the story. Hitler wanted a bomber, the generals wanted a fighter, time was slipping away. It's true, that conflict existed, but it doesn't explain everything. The real barrier was much deeper, systemic. Germany in 1944 was trying to build a spaceship in a garage while the house around it was burning. The Jumo 004 jet engine was the heart of this machine, and that heart was flawed. Not because the designers were incompetent, they were brilliant. The problem was that building a jet engine requires metals Germany simply no longer had. You need chromium, nickel, cobalt. Without them, turbine blades spinning at around 8,700 revolutions per minute and enduring temperatures of hundreds of degrees simply begin to melt. German engineers had to rely on what they called substitute steel. The result? Engine lifespan ranged from 20 to 25 hours. Just imagine that. After every 2 or 3 flights, the engines had to be removed and essentially rebuilt. This isn't an army. It's a desperate experiment conducted on a massive scale. At Luftwaffe headquarters, there was chaos. On one hand, they had a machine that could theoretically shoot down any B-17 flying fortress. On the other, a logistical system lying in ruins. The Me262 required special fuel, J2 synthetic jet fuel. It required concrete runways more than 1 kilometer long because it was heavy and slow during takeoff, and those runways were the first targets for Allied bombers. It was a systemic paradox. The more advanced the aircraft was, the more vulnerable it became to the enemy's brutal, simple advantage in numbers. The Luftwaffe feared the Me262 because it exposed the truth. Technology without infrastructure is just an expensive way to lose a war. On May 22, 1943, General Adolf Galland, a fighter ace and a man who knew everything there was to know about flying, climbed into a prototype of the Me262. After landing, he said words that would pass into aviation history. It didn't feel like I was flying. It felt as if angels were pushing me. It sounds beautiful. But Galland was a professional. He knew that this angel had very sharp claws. Let's look at it from a pilot's perspective. You sit in the cockpit. There's no propeller in front of your eyes, giving you incredible visibility. You don't feel the vibrations that shake every other aircraft of that era. It's quieter, smoother. You are the fastest human being on the planet, but that advantage was also your greatest curse. Air combat in 1944 was a dance at 250 to 300 miles per hour. Pilots were trained for that. They knew how to calculate lead, when to pull the trigger. The Me262 entered that dance at over 520 miles per hour. And that's where the human drama begins. When you're flying that fast, you only have seconds to react. You close on a bomber formation so quickly your eyes can barely interpret what you're seeing. You squeeze the trigger of 4 30mm cannons. It's a monstrous amount of firepower, but you only have a moment. If you miss on the first pass, by the time you turn around, you're already miles away. Young boys, accelerated training courses, inexperienced pilots thrown into cockpits of machines that required almost superhuman precision. They were afraid of this airplane. They knew that one mistake with the throttle, one sudden movement, and the engines could burst into flames. The Me262 did not forgive mistakes. There was no second chance. If an engine failed during combat, you instantly became a 6-ton glider, a very expensive glider. If you want to understand why this aircraft was tragic, we have to talk about landing. That was the moment of truth. The Me262 was a predator at 23,000 feet, but the moment it descended to land, it became prey. Jet engines of that generation responded to throttle with a massive delay. If a pilot realized he was coming in too short and tried to add power, the engine needed precious seconds to spool up. Sometimes it simply flamed out. Sometimes it exploded. The Allies quickly understood this. They didn't need to fight the Swallows in the air, where they were strongest. They waited for them at their homes. They called it rat catching, hunting jet fighters when they slowed down during takeoff or landing. American pilots flying Mustangs and Thunderbolts circled above German jet bases. They waited until the Me262, low on fuel, with an exhausted pilot, lowered its landing gear and slowed for landing. At that moment, it was helpless. It couldn't escape, it couldn't maneuver. There was something humiliating about this. The most advanced aircraft in the world was being destroyed by old piston engine fighters simply because it had to touch the ground. The Luftwaffe had to create special protection units. Focke-Wulf 190 fighters flew cover above jet airfields to protect them during landing. Think about that. You have to send 10 old fighters into the air so that one new one can land safely. Is that still progress, or already pure desperation? Near the end of the war, a unit called Jagdverband 44 was formed, the Squadron of Experts. Galland gathered there a group of aces whom Hitler had previously removed from command for insubordination. Men with Knight's Crosses, men with hundreds of victories. This was not a normal military unit. It was a suicide club equipped with the best hardware in the world. Johannes Steinhoff, one of the finest pilots of that era, later described flying the Me262 as something close to a daily negotiation with death. Not so much with the enemy, but with the machine itself and the conditions it demanded. They had no illusions about the outcome of the war anymore. They didn't believe in final victory. They flew because they were soldiers, and they flew the Me262 because it was the only way left to feel superior, even for a moment, against an enemy that overwhelmed them with sheer numbers. But even they, the elite of the elite, struggled with this aircraft. Steinhoff himself nearly died when a tire burst during takeoff. The aircraft turned into a ball of fire. He survived, but his face remained a mask of scars for the rest of his life, a reminder of a technology that had leapt ahead of its time, but could save no one. In the hands of JV-44, the Me262 was like a scalpel in the hands of a surgeon whose hospital had just collapsed. They could make a few perfect cuts, they could shoot down a few bombers, but the patient was already dying on the operating table. When the war ended, the victors rushed to these aircraft as if they were treasure. Americans, Britons, Russians, everyone wanted to understand how it worked. The Me262 became one of the foundations of the post-war jet age. Early Soviet and American jet fighters, the ones that would later clash in Korea, grew directly from lessons learned from this machine. But does that mean the aircraft was a success? We often make the mistake of judging weapons only by their statistics. Speed, armament, ceiling. By those measures, the Me262 was unmatched. But weapons do not exist in a vacuum. They exist within systems. And the system that produced the Swallow was sick. To me, the Me262 is a symbol of technological arrogance. Proof that it's possible to create something brilliant that is, at the same time, completely useless. This machine didn't shorten the war. It didn't save German cities from bombing. The only thing it truly did was add a chapter to aviation history filled with the roar of turbines and the tragic stories of people trapped between the future and collapse. I've always wondered about one thing. What must it feel like to sit in the fastest airplane in the world and know there is nowhere left to run? Because no matter how fast you fly, sooner or later the fuel runs out, and on the ground, nothing is waiting for you but ruins. Maybe that's why the Luftwaffe feared it so much. Not because it was a new airplane, but because it was the final scream of a world that was already disappearing.